Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Today, we will be doing BRT Planning Part 201, which will be a focus on service planning. Today, our host is Dr. Walter Hook, currently the Vice President and Principal of the firm BRT Planning International. Previously to BRT Planning International, Walter was the former CEO of ITDP, which he led for 21 years. Dr. Hook holds a PhD from the School of Urban Planning at Columbia University, where he also served as an adjunct professor. Apart from all of the great work that he has contributed to ITDP, he continues to be involved and will specifically talk about his contributions to the planning guide today. Walter?
Yeah, hi. Welcome, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about Volume 2, the Operations chapter of the new guide, and specifically about the Service Planning chapter, which is Chapter 6. So let's just go straight into it. Before we dive into Chapter 6, I just wanted to give a very brief few slides about what is in chapters 4 and 5, because the key information you need to know for chapter 6. So chapter 4 is about the estimation of the demand on your future BRT corridor. And in order to do your demand modeling, the new guide is following our current practice, which is moving away from traditional 4-step demand modeling because it's proven to be too slow and it requires a lot of household survey data that we never have, and it's not actually very accurate at the stop level, and it's the boarding and alighting numbers at the stops that you really need for service planning and design purposes. So what we recommend is that everybody do pretty detailed route by route boarding and alighting surveys of all of your existing bus routes that are going to be using whatever corridor you've decided to design a BRT system on, and then to do transfer surveys at very high demand points, at points where you observe a lot of transfer activity happening. And from that, a modeler can usually create a transit-specific OD matrix using probability. That boarding and alighting per route data you're going to need for the service planning tools that we're going to be talking about next. I also wanted to mention that the way you select the corridor, the BRT corridor that you're going to build, usually it's a good idea to give your key decision makers information about what the existing public transit demand is on a variety of corridors, what the existing delay faced by the existing buses on those corridors is, what the future demand might look like given development approvals and what's in government strategic plans. Finally, you are going to look at the right-of-way and how easy or expensive it would be to build a BRT. And when you tee up all that information for your political leadership, at the end of the day, they're going to pick a corridor for political reasons, but you hope that it will be a sound technical decision. So this slide is an example that we did while I was still at ITDP, which shows the demand, which means all the passengers on buses on each section of road, and the width of the lines you're looking at shows you the loads on the buses on each link of the road. So the wider that is, the more passengers that are passing down that road during the peak hour. Now the color of the line indicates the speed, and the red indicates the slow speed, and the yellow medium speed, etc. Green is a high speed. So you want to think about putting BRT on your corridors that have both high demand and slow speeds. And a map like this is usually a very good way to start a conversation. We often then want to look a little bit about where people are planning to build new developments. And you can look at sort of building approvals and also strategic plans to sort of help guide that. This map we did also in Boston, which in the thick lines shows the corridors that we identified as having slow speeds and high public transit demand, and it juxtaposes the locations of high development. The next thing you want to look at is the roads. Obviously, it's pretty tough to build a BRT corridor down a low density, narrow commercial strip like shown here. You can do it, but you know it's going to be a little bit more challenging. So you put all those things together, and then you hope that the political leadership will make an intelligent choice. Okay. So now we've picked our corridor, and we've done some boarding and lighting surveys and some transfer surveys. So we've got a pretty good idea of the existing demand. And now I'm going to walk you through the basic service planning concepts that you're going to kind of need to understand as you get into the more detailed planning process. So the first thing you need to do is figure out what is the peak hour. So you've done this boarding and lighting data collection on all of the roads that are using the corridor that you've picked. And you're going to then look, and this little table here shows you the number of people on each bus that are passing by the part of the corridor that you think is going to have the highest demand. And you just look at what for 15-minute periods each one of those represents a bus is the biggest total. And that then becomes your peak hour. Now this is just a little formula that I find I always forget, so we put it in here. If you know the travel time, you can calculate the speed if you also know the distance, etc. So often what we do in the early planning stages is we look at the distance of the corridor. Let's say it's 10 kilometers. And we can then derive, we usually assume that if the BRT would move at a good BRT pace, it would move 25 kilometers an hour. And if the current buses, let's say they're probably running about 10 kilometers an hour, if they were running much faster, you probably wouldn't need to build a BRT there. So this is just a set of relationships. We put it here so that you don't forget how to do this kind of basic equation. The next thing you need to know about each of your bus routes on your BRT corridor is what is the cycle time. Now the cycle time is the amount of time it takes for the bus to leave the place where it starts, to go to the place where it ends. There's usually a little layover there. The driver's got to go out and use the bathroom or whatever, get back on the bus, and then return to where the bus starts. That's called the cycle time. Now, the way you figure out what the cycle time is you use the formula from the previous page. So in this case, it's 10 kilometers from the origin to the destination, 10 kilometers back. You know that that's going to take a certain amount of time based on the speed. If it's going to be BRT, it's going to be 25 kilometers an hour. If it's a regular bus, we're going to assume for now it's 10 kilometers an hour. So your cycle time, when you add the layover for the current bus, is going to be 125 minutes to make that full cycle. And for a BRT, it's going to be 53 minutes. You're going to need these formulas when we move on to other things. The next thing you're going to need to do is figure out what is the critical link. The critical link is the part of your proposed BRT corridor that has the most current bus passengers passing through it. So on this diagram here, which you can generate using your boarding and alighting data for each route, each time you do a boarding and alighting survey, you can calculate how many people are on each bus. That's called the loads. When you add all the loads together for each bus during the peak hour and you put them together, you end up with a map like this. So the critical link is the place where where the loads are the highest. That's the where the loads are, where that red line is the widest. And then the maximum load on the critical link is the actual number of passengers that are passing through that particular link in one direction. So those are two concepts that you need to have pretty much at your fingertips: the critical link and the maximum load on the critical link. Okay, next slide. The next thing you need to know is a little bit about how you calculate the capacity of a bus. For planning purposes, we usually use a little formula, which is the length of the bus in meters, -3 times 10. The reason for that is you need about 3 meters for the driver and the entrance, a little bit in the back where the engine is. That usually consumes about 3 meters of the length of the bus. And then each of the remaining meters length usually can hold about 10 people at capacity. That's going to be a very crowded bus. And usually you don't want to design around that number. You want to give the service a little bit of wiggle room, so you use a load factor of 85%. And that little table there shows you the 4 types of buses that you're probably going to be restricted to using when you're designing a BRT system: a 9-meter minibus, a 12-meter bus, an articulated bus, which is 18 meters, or a bi-artic. Not so many people use them, but in some high-demand corridors we do. And this table just shows you what the capacity of those buses are, and the capacity would be once you factor in an 85% load factor. Okay, the next slide. So the next thing you can do is figure out what your frequency would be on that corridor. So you've found your critical link on your corridor. You've found what the maximum load is on the critical link. And it's easy at that point just to figure out what the frequency will be by simply dividing the maximum load for the peak hour by the capacity of the bus adjusted for that 85% load factor. So in this case, we're saying, all right, we'll assume the existing maximum load is 500. Our bus, we'll say we're using 18-meter articulated buses. Each bus would hold 127 people, so 4 buses would move everybody. Now, what happens if you decide to use a 9-meter bus? Well, you still have the same maximum load on that link. So let's say it's 500. Now you can have a frequency of 9 buses per hour to move the same number of people. Now that's obviously much better for customers because a bus comes by every few minutes rather than 4 times an hour. So, but how do you make that decision? That's what we're going to discuss next. Now, a brief digression about this. Because this service plan chapter is for BRT corridors, we're assuming that it's a pretty high demand corridor. So on a pretty high demand corridor, you're pretty much always going to set the frequency based on the maximum load divided by the vehicle's capacity adjusted for the load factor. In a lot of corridors, in a lot of bus corridors, the frequency is actually a policy decision. So you hear a lot of discussion these days about frequent bus service and what does that mean? Well, what it means is that if you took the max load and divided it by the bus capacity, you would end up with a number that was so low that it's sort of socially unacceptable. So then you're caught in a situation where you have to decide, okay, we have limited resources. Can we pump up the frequency on some corridors and not on other corridors? But if you've already picked a BRT corridor with high demand, you don't need to worry about policy-derived frequencies. So which determines which? The frequency, you want high frequency for better service, or the vehicle capacity. You want to use a bigger vehicle to save money. Well, the simple method that we're recommending in the new version of the guide is to start with an optimal frequency. And we call the optimal frequency 22 vehicles per hour. And we use that frequency because basically people like higher frequency, but once you get more than 22 vehicles per hour, the buses, they start to bunch up in ways that makes the service very irregular. And people really don't like irregular service, and it has all kinds of adverse consequences. It drops the capacity of the system, it drops the speeds, etc. So just from empirical observation, Pedro Szasz, from whom most of these formulas have come, determined that the optimal frequency was 22 buses per hour. So if you start with that, you can then take the maximum load on your critical link and use this table that we provided here. And we say, okay, normally once you build a BRT system, you're going to get about a 20% bump on demand. And all of this is just for planning purposes. So let's say currently you have 2,000 passengers as your maximum load on the critical link. You assume you're going to get a few extras with a BRT, maybe 2,400. If you simply divide that by 22, then the optimal bus size is going to be 109. That's more people than you can really handle with a regular 12-meter bus. So you're probably going to go for an articulated bus. That's a pretty high demand corridor. And if you've got fewer, you're going to use smaller and smaller vehicles. So that's a kind of rule of thumb, and it's probably enough for planning purposes. Probably you'll never go beyond that. The chapter includes a much more complicated methodology for optimizing the vehicle size, where it weighs the extra weighting costs that the passengers will face due to lower frequency against the operating costs that you'd be saving by using a larger bus. Those would be the fixed bus costs that don't vary with the vehicle's size. So this formula, you'd have to unpack it and read that to understand it. Most of the time, you probably don't need to go into this much detail. Now, once you've determined a sort of reasonable size for your corridor, you can then start to determine what the actual frequency would be with that specific size vehicle, because you really only have 4 choices, and then you go back and get an actual frequency. And like a lot of these things, the process is more or less iterative. So once you've determined the size of your vehicle, you can go back and determine the fleet that you're going to need to provide the service on the corridor. So the fleet, as a first pass, you're probably going to do what most people do, which is you're going to take the maximum load for that service, for that route, and you're going to multiply it by the cycle time, which we explained, and you're going to simply divide that number by the vehicle's capacity adjusted for the load factor. So that's going to give you the estimated amount of your fleet. If your cycle time is very long, the bus has to go a very long way. It's not going to be able to return to pick up additional passengers. So the maximum load has to be multiplied by the cycle time. And there's a small error in the current version of the planning guide that the TC got dropped from the formula, but not from the example. So just to be aware, we'll get that correct. So with that number, you know if you have a regular bus, you know let's say your current cycle time is going to be 125 minutes. With BRT, it's going to be 53 minutes. We know that if we use that formula, with the current type of bus and the current speeds, we're going to need 21 buses. So maybe we don't know what the actual fleet is, but we can use these formulas to figure out the current service probably has about 21 buses. We know if we upgraded that service to a BRT speed at 25 kilometers an hour, using this formula, we would only need 9 vehicles. So these formulas will then already give you your preliminary service fleet numbers. Okay, so that number is generally not too far off, usually give or take 20%. However, because of the peaking of demand, it's not precisely accurate. So if you really want to know what the fleet you're going to need is, given that your demand is peaked, you're going to need to use a slightly modified formula, which requires another concept called the maximum load per cycle per route. And I'm going to try to explain that to you because it becomes important when we start talking about the advantages of trunk and feeders and direct services. So the maximum load per cycle is the number of maximum passenger demand that will cross your critical link on your BRT corridor during the course of time that is equal to one bus's cycle time. Now we're going to use, for an example, a 1 hour cycle time to just walk you through it. So let's assume that your bus leaves the station at 6:45. It's picked up whatever passengers were there. And in the upper left-hand corner, you see these are all of our buses that are arriving at different times, but how many passengers are on them. And you'll notice that from 7 to 7:45 are the 4 buses that have the most people on them. So that period of time is your peak hour. So the bus pulls out at 6:45 with whatever passengers came before. And then at 7 o'clock, there are 63 people sitting there waiting. And then another 15 minutes go by, and then you have 132 people there. And then another 15 minutes goes by, and you have 199 people waiting there. And then another 15 minutes goes by, and you have 265 people waiting there. That number, 265 people that would have accumulated over the course of the time it took your bus to make its full cycle, that's the maximum load per cycle. And in order to derive the fleet accurately, factoring in the fact that demand is peaked, you need to use that formula. You need to use that number, the maximum load per cycle per route, to derive the fleet. So if you do here, the maximum load per cycle for 1 hour was 265. And you divide that one by the vehicle size, adjusted for the load factor, you end up with if you're using a 9-meter bus, you end up with 5.19 passengers, which is too many. You have to round up to 6. So your vehicle fleet is 6. So it's a slightly different formula, but it factors in the peak of demand. Those are all the basic concepts that you need for service planning. You need to understand them pretty well because everything gets a lot more complicated from here on. But those basic things are enough to get you a long way. And that's why I spent a fair bit of time on. Okay, so the next part of the guide is determine which routes you're going to basically bring into your BRT system as part of the BRT's services. Normally, whatever BRT corridor you've chosen, it already has a whole lot of bus routes on it, and you're going to have to think about what to do with them. So here's an example of a project we did in Montgomery County. They wanted to put BRT on Route 355, Rockville Pike, and a lot of the routes, they don't actually overlap the corridor the whole way. They come on, they go off. So normally the first thing we do is we look at the routes that are currently using the BRT corridor, and if they're going off or coming onto the corridor, and they only overlap the corridor for about 25% or less, we figure maybe we're not going to include that service in our BRT service because usually with a BRT, you're going to require them to buy a new bus. And in order for that investment to make sense, there's got to be a significant amount of time savings. And if there's, if you're not using the BRT infrastructure for very much, it may not be worth it. So the first pass is usually just a quick look at how much the routes that already exist overlap the corridor. And here's an example of all the routes that use 355 and the degree to which they overlap the corridor, how many passengers they had. If it's like a huge demand of passengers, you might look at it a little more carefully. But as a rule of thumb, usually if it's less than 25% overlap, we're pretty much not going to include it. The next thing you want to think about is the administrative control over the buses. Now, this is a picture of Delhi. These two buses, the yellow and the blue buses, are operated by different branches of the government. And the yellow buses were very poorly administered and they tended to fail all the time. So when we designed, when we were making recommendations to the Delhi government, we suggested that they not allow those buses into their BRT corridor because they couldn't control them. And if they break down in your corridor, that becomes a big problem. Sometimes you've got like inner city buses, et cetera. You really don't want buses that you can't control inside your BRT system because if they break down, you've got a big problem. You can't control the specification of the vehicle, et cetera. The next thing you want to do is you want to essentially add as many bus routes as possible into your dedicated bus lane, so as many people as possible can benefit, up until the point where your bus lane saturates and it becomes too slow. Now here's a picture which is pretty typical of some of the more poorly designed BRT systems in China, where you've got an empty bus lane on the left with nobody using it. And on the right, you've got most of the buses that are just operating like they always did in mixed traffic. Now that's a relatively poorly thought through service plan because most of the passengers are not benefiting from the dedicated lane or the other BRT elements. Now here's an example that we're working on in Seattle where there's a bus corridor on 3rd Avenue, which has huge bus volumes. And because they shut the tunnel underneath of it, there's a bus tunnel under it that's becoming only light rail. They kind of move another 100 buses an hour onto this 3rd Avenue corridor. And that corridor is saturated. So you really don't want to add any more buses to a saturated corridor. So there's going to be a kind of point at which your busway is going to saturate and there's no more benefit to adding more buses to the corridor. So the way you calculate the saturation is pretty straightforward. You simply take the amount of dwell time that each bus on average takes at the bus stop that's the most backed up, and you multiply that by the number of buses. And when that number gets to be over 144 seconds, which is 40% of an hour, you consider it saturated. So you don't want to you wouldn't want to add any more frequency onto that corridor if your buses are already consuming 40% of the hour at that stop. Now, let's say you had many bus routes and they were all using a corridor, and you had to decide which bus routes you should allow to use the bus corridor and which ones you're going to not allow to use the corridor. And the planning guide has proposed, this came from Pedro Szasz, a formula for prioritizing them. And intuitively, it essentially says this: the buses that you want to add to the BRT lane first are those which move the most passengers through the corridor, but consume the least time at the bottleneck station, because you want to get as many people benefiting from the dedicated lane as possible, without saturating the bus stop, because that bus stop is causing the whole lane to slow down. So he's come up with this little metric, and when you plug it into a formula like this, you can then prioritize each one of your routes and keep adding them to your corridor until your saturation level reaches about 4. And at that point, you're going to cut it off and say the rest of these bus routes, even though they're on this road, we're going to require them to operate in mixed traffic, or we're going to reroute them somewhere else. Now, those problems are all problems that service planners face because usually they don't have control entirely over the BRT infrastructure. If you have full control over the BRT infrastructure, you're going to simply design it with enough capacity at the peak station to accommodate all the buses that you can possibly accommodate. But usually that's the practical reality, is you only have one lane, and then the lane's going to saturate. Okay. So the next thing we're going to talk about is direct services versus trunk and feeder services. And that's probably all we're going to have time for, but it'll be more than enough to think about. So the basic difference, I assume people are a little bit familiar with. A direct service BRT is a BRT system where you have a bus that operates in mixed traffic, and then it joins a BRT trunk corridor with dedicated lanes and fancy off-board fare collection at nice stations. And then perhaps the bus again leaves that corridor and continues on in mixed traffic to some other destination. That would be, for instance, how the services work in the Hartford New Britain BRT that was recently given a silver rating. The other way you design a BRT system is like Lima here, but Bogota is designed like this, so is Curitiba. You have a certain very large articulated or biarticulated bus running up and down the BRT trunk line, and that bus only operates inside the BRT, and it brings you to a transfer terminal where a large chunk of the passengers will get off and transfer to a different bus that will finish their journey in a mixed traffic environment. That trunk and feeder service was the traditional approach to rail services because the rail lines didn't have the possibility to continue in 5 directions in a mixed traffic setting. And that rail type of service plan was brought into the BRT space thinking that maybe that was a good idea. And it has some advantages and it has some disadvantages that we're going to go over now. So the first thing you have to think about is whether your off-corridor streets can accommodate the buses that you select for your BRT system. So we have a lot of situations particularly in the developing world where once you get off the main arterials, you're looking at narrow streets winding through favelas, et cetera, and your BRT buses are often simply too large to operate on these roads, or perhaps you just don't want them to get damaged in poorly maintained roads. So those services you would probably think turn into feeder routes. The following things are the sort of pros and cons of one or the other. So the first thing we're going to discuss is the fleet requirements of trunk and feeder versus direct services. Then we're going to discuss the efficiency you get from having larger vehicles. Then we're going to look at the issue of transfer and terminal delay, and we'll briefly touch on station and platform saturation. So the first point is that as we discussed in the beginning, you're going to determine the amount of fleet you need based on the maximum load on the critical link. So in a direct service situation, in the top of the diagram, we've drawn a red line where the maximum load might well be. All those different routes have joined up together with all their passengers on the trunk corridor, and large numbers of passengers are passing through there, that's the critical link. When you're then going to build a trunk and feeder BRT line, the chances are you're going to place your transfer terminal right where all those routes diverge. Now, in that case, you're going to have to set the fleet for your feeder buses based on the maximum load at the critical link. And on your feeder buses, there's a pretty high likelihood that the maximum load is right before you get to the terminal. And your trunk line is also likely to be at maximum load somewhere along the trunk, but probably quite close to the terminal as well, because all those passengers have just gotten onto the trunk. So it's a reasonably safe assumption to say that the maximum load on the critical link for the trunk is going to be similar to the total of the maximum loads on the critical links of all the feeders if you were to add them up. So now we go back to our fleet calculation and we look at what fleet we would need for the maximum, for the direct service. We're going to assume that the cycle time is 2 hours. They're going the full way, from out somewhere far into the downtown and all the way back again. And so over the course of 2 hours, 448 passengers would accumulate. And with a 9-meter bus holding 51 people, we would need a fleet of 9 vehicles. Now, let's say we split that into a trunk service and a feeder service. Now you've got maximum load per cycle of 265 because it's a 1 hour period of time instead of a 2 hour period of time. And the maximum load per cycle, because the critical link is roughly near the transfer terminal, it's about the same for the trunk and for the totality of the feeders. So we're going to assume that the feeder lines have a 265 maximum load per cycle for both the trunk and for the feeder. Now you'll notice that because the peak, there's more people in that short time frame than there is over the 2 hour time frame, is higher. The max load for 1 hour doubled is higher than the 2 hour max load per cycle. So what this does for you is when you divide your 265 max load per cycle by the 51 passengers per bus, you end up needing 5.19 buses, round up to 6, and then for the trunk and for the feeder. So you're going to then need 12 vehicles. So instead of needing 9 vehicles, you now need 12 vehicles. And to put this sort of simply, it's because the trunk and the feeder services generally split the demand at the critical link of one or both of the routes. And the result is that this peak demand needs to be served essentially twice, once by the trunk buses and once by the feeder buses. Whereas the direct services, they carry that same peak demand all the way through. So while their routes are longer and more fleet is needed per route, the complete demand is served. This is something that very few people understand, and it's something that Pedro Szasz has sort of tried to explain. I've tried to break it down as simply as possible. Now you're going to say, wait a minute, though. If we had a trunk corridor, we're going to use a much bigger vehicle on that trunk route, and that's true. So you're going to get some benefit from using a much larger vehicle on your trunk corridor than you would have for the direct services, which have split the demand into a lot of separate routes. So in this slide, we're just sort of trying to give you a rule of thumb to think about what your corridor looks like and how much benefit you're likely to get if you have a trunk and feeder versus a direct service. And it turns out if your trunk is very, very long relative to the length of your feeder routes, then there's more benefit to a trunk feeder system because you can use your much bigger, much more efficient vehicles for a much longer period of time and for a much larger part of your journey. Similarly, if you have a very large number of feeder routes that are channeling your demand onto your trunk, again, you'll have more benefits from your trunk and feeder system than if you have just a few feeders. So this diagram shows you if your corridor looks like the top diagram where you have many, many feeder routes that all join together and then travel a very long distance on a common arterial, that looks like a better case for a trunk and feeder BRT. In the lower diagram, you just have 2 or 3 routes coming together and they only overlap for a short period of time. The range of benefits for that, for a trunk feeder from the efficiency gains from the larger vehicle, they're likely to be low in the range of like 5%.
Hi, Walter.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I just
That's
want to
okay.
let you know we have about 15 minutes remaining
Right.
and just to incorporate questions later on. As of now, we don't have that many questions, so please go ahead and continue, but I just wanted to give you a time check.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm going to then finish this trunk and feeder section, and then we'll stop at that point. Okay. So another thing you have to factor in when you're considering the advantages of trunk feeder or direct service is the indirectness of route. Now, sometimes, because you're only going to probably build one transfer terminal and you're not going to build 5 of them, sometimes the feeder routes are going to leave your trunk corridor in slightly different locations than one another. And you're going to have to reroute them to a transfer terminal in a common location. And that's going to cause some indirectness of route for a fair number of passengers. And oftentimes you can't actually build your transfer facility directly on top of your BRT corridor. Here in Bogota in the upper right, there's a transfer terminal right on top of the corridor. That's an amazing location. It's also a depot right on the corridor, which is amazing. But often, as was the case in León, Mexico, they could only get the land about 600 meters off the corridor. So every trunk bus and every feeder bus has to go 600 meters out of its way twice to make that transfer happen. I'm going to skip this, but we can talk about it in if people have questions. There's a slight error in the defense of transfers and trunk feeders in human transit's work, which is interesting that we could talk about, but I'll just won't go through it now. So in total, you've got a big transfer and terminal delay related to the trunk feeder system. You've also got to factor in the waiting time inside the terminal for your second vehicle, also the walking time to reach your bus stop to the feeder bus stop, and you also have to factor in the cost of constructing that terminal, acquiring the land, etc. Now, there is another circumstance where trunk feeder might solve a lot of your problems. A trunk feeder system is going to reduce the number of different routes on your trunk to 1 or 2. So you have T1, T2, something like this. And what that means, if you're one of the passengers waiting, say, at a station along your trunk line, you're going to be able to get on the next bus that comes. And that means that there's going to be fewer people accumulating on the platforms along the corridor because they don't have to wait for bus 26 to come. They'll get on the first bus and they'll go. A lot of times you don't have the width to build a full BRT station in the middle of your trunk corridor. In Guangzhou, which is like the preeminent BRT system with direct services that we built, Carl designed and his team, and that we were involved in, that required a very significant amount of width at all the stations, which was easier to do in China than it is in some other places. So if you don't have the width for a station platform, trunk feeder moves that transfer point to a transfer terminal that would be at the ends of the corridor where you'd probably be easier for you to get land. So that's something you might have to factor in. So I think okay, so that's it for the discussion about trunk feeder. What the rest of the chapter talks about is, and I'm not going to go into today, but I'll just flag it for you, is how to decide where to eliminate stops, how to decide about whether to add express services or limited stop services, and what the stopping patterns should be. And then it also discusses whether you should combine routes to avoid transfers, etc. But we're not going to go into that today. So let's leave it at that and take any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Walter. I'm going to go ahead and address some of the questions that were submitted today. For example, Jim asked, does the distance that the bus is at max load matter? If it's very short, do you allow crush loads?
The distance matters mostly for the efficiency of your system. Usually an indicator of it is your renovation rate or how much people are getting on and off of your buses. So if there's a very low renovation rate, meaning mostly the passengers that get on stay on for a long period of time, usually your loads are more elongated along your corridor. Those kind of services are the benefits to trunk BRT are higher if you have the loads continue for longer distances. They're less efficient bus routes because you don't get the additional revenue from people getting on and off all the time.
Great, thank you. And I've just put together, put up a template slide here of the BRT planning guide for all of you to look at as we answer the questions. The next question is, does fleet size include vehicle utilization factor? Some proportion of buses shall be in garage and not in service, say 2 to 5%.
It doesn't. That's just a simple, we didn't mention that, and it would be a good thing to add to a later version of the guide. We're noticing that in sort of first world, the reserve fleets are pretty high, you know, they're in fact, the US FTA accepts a reserve fleet of 20%, but when you get out to the Latin America and the developing world with private operators, you're seeing more like 8-10% reserve fleet, sometimes even lower. So those figures don't include that. If you want to include a reserve fleet, which is a good idea, you know, as a rule of thumb, just add 8 to 10%, I would say, if you're using private operators.
Great, thank you. For the next question, just want to make sure I'm not on mute. It was submitted online. Why do we consider the walking distance time as a factor for calculating the stop spacing between rapid transit stops? Why not an existing high frequency route overlapping the BRT or community transit service to be planned as a seamless access to BRT to increase its coverage area?
I guess, can you read it again? I didn't quite understand the question.
Yes, sorry. Why do we consider the walking distance and time as a factor for calculating the stop spacing between rapid transit stops? Why not an existing high-frequency route overlapping the BRT or a community transit service to be planned as a seamless access to BRT?
This chapter 6 doesn't really go into walking times in any great detail. I didn't cover it today, but when you're thinking about removing stops, which is a lot of what BRTs do in North America, is they eliminate stops that have been sort of put in as a result of community pressure. And there's a trade-off in terms of stop elimination between the speed of the bus and the passengers on it and the reduced walking times of the people that would be using that stop. So obviously, if you have relatively few people boarding the bus there, you're sort of prejudicing the travel time of all of the high volume of people on the bus by adding additional stops at low volume. So it gives some formulas for figuring that out. You know, you can model it in any way that you want. If you want to assume that you're going to have some kind of other service there, you can make that assumption. You know, there's nobody stopping you.
Great, thank you. The next question is, how do we calculate the demand regarding the future under the assumption that demand grows until BRT route will be ready for operations due to urbanization, for example? Hopefully because people will shift from private cars to BRT, as in not just calculating for former bus travels.
It depends what you're estimating the demand for. So if you're estimating the demand for financial modeling purposes, you should be more conservative. So what we would recommend is that when you've done sort of that first pass on which bus routes to include in your new BRT service, those that overlap the corridor for a significant distance, and the other things we discussed, you take those existing bus demand numbers, and for financial modeling purposes, you probably assume you would bump the demand up by 25%, because you'd probably be getting higher speeds. You're going to pull people off of other buses and out of other modes. And that's just an empirical observation that usually the modal shift is if it's good system, well designed, you're going to get in the 10 to 20% range. If you're designing the physical infrastructure and you're in a place like China where you really don't know how fast the development is going to come, you're going to want to make more conservative assumptions in the other way. You're going to assume, all right, well, what if the demand doubled, you know? And for that, we recommended that you map the current processes of new construction, you know, building approvals, or if it's a city with enforced strategic development plan, look at those plans and make some estimates about what you think is going to happen to future demand. And so for physical design purposes, you probably want to design to double the existing demand. So just to be safe, because the infrastructure is going to be sitting there for 15 years or more, you don't want to have to rebuild it. But in the end, the modeling to estimate demand is very, very complicated, and it's almost never the case that you have enough data to do modeling that's going to improve much upon your judgment and your sort of back of the envelope estimate doing what I just described.
Great, thank you. We have only 1 minute left, so I'm going to try to get these last questions in. From Sandy Davis, do you have any recommendations on scheduling or headway management, especially for using the model where these feeders pass through the terminal to continue in service as a BRT?
The guide doesn't give you a lot of information in that level of detail. There are scheduling softwares, and there's a whole industry around it that once you have a system in operation are going to help you optimize your service performance and, you know, tweak your services in a whole lot of ways. This guide is really more a planning level. So it's like, okay, how many buses do we need? Where are they going to go? How much investment do we need? It's really a sort of pre-implementation guide. So it's not going to tell you much about like how do we refine the services to deal with, you know, very specific problems. It's probably not that useful for that.
Great, thank you. And I will fit in this last question, and please know any questions that were unanswered, we are included with, we will include in a follow-up email and also on our website. Is there any precedence for a low maximum speed for buses in downtown or main streets, such as potential benefits being pedestrian comfort, transit efficiency, reduced braking and acceleration? For example, in Amsterdam, the trams run at 20 kilometers per hour in the center.
Can you have the second question, too?
Mm-hmm.
What was the question part again? I didn't quite follow.
A precedent for low maximum speeds for buses in downtown and main streets.
Oh, yeah. I mean, most BRT systems with operational control systems, and that's a good number of them, such as Transmilenio in Bogota, they have very clear speed restrictions for the sections of the routes that pass through downtown. And they're enforceable through the contracts, which will penalize the operating companies if they are traveling above safe speeds in those zones.
Great, thank you. And then this will be the last question, but as I said, if there are more, please feel free to email me, and any unanswered ones from today will be followed up on our website. So to wrap up, are there benchmarks in terms of headways for high frequency corridors, such as a policy decision, where you might want a maximum headway of 8 or 10 minutes in all corridors, despite of what the calculations indicate for the headway?
There is some literature out there, and it does show that you get a little bump of demand if you've got headways 10 minutes or less. And then you've got a little gray area between 10 and 12 to 15 minutes. But I guess in the developed world, we consider 10 minutes a pretty frequent service. They're usually the metrics also involve like off-peak and weekends and this kind of thing, because the point that Human Transit and others are making is that you essentially don't want to have to know what the schedule is. You want to know that if you go to a bus stop, on average, you're only going to wait for 5 minutes for a bus. And if you have to wait 10, it's no big deal. So, but you would probably want to do what those experts are suggesting, which is to really prioritize which of your routes should have that kind of frequency. You're going to hope that the demand builds on those routes, and those routes would then become obvious candidates for upgrading the infrastructure to full BRT. So I think it's those frequent routes that you want to start encouraging the demand to build up on, that you're going to be looking to do BRT investment.
Great, thank you. So thank you to all the attendees for being here at the webinar today. As you see on this slide, you can see where to find the BRT planning guide, because there were quite a few questions about that and references. So please make sure to visit that link and look through the guide if you have not yet. Another point to remember is that what makes a BRT planning guide special is that it's a living and working document. So beyond seeing the content there, it lives online to be updated and edited. So please continue to look through the guide, but also offer any questions, suggestions, new information to the email on the website, because those can be incorporated as contributors and authors continue to work on the guide. And then secondly, if this slide will move. And then secondly, we have another BRT Planning Guide webinar on March 14th. It will be hosted by Carlos Pardo from Despacio, based in Bogota, Colombia. And he will be speaking about the communication strategy and the importance of branding and information as we plan BRT systems. So again, thank you. I want to say thank you to Walter also for hosting this webinar today. And all the slides will be available online once we receive all the information. And this recording will also be available on our website. So please feel free to watch it again and share with any